and welcome to the first narrated video for the history of. In this video, we will be discussing serfdom, indentured servitude, and slavery. Serfdom. This term derives from medieval Europe and the word serf. Typically, serfs were tenant farmers who did not own their own land and would rent their lands and homes from their landlords. The landlord's titles gave him the right to own the land, and giving him the right over the serfs. The difference between the serfs and slaves were serfs were bound to the land, whereas slaves were bought and sold regardless of the land in which they came from. Much of what serfs could and could not do was bound by his lord's wish. Permission from everything from marriage to moving was required by the landlord. Serfdom continued. Serfs were spread over the continent of Europe from Poland to Hungary, and even including countries that would later unify, such as Germany and Italy. Serfdom tended to continue until approximately the 14th to 15th centuries in Europe, depending upon the locale. Some countries abolished serfdom sooner than others, while others clung to it for quite a while longer. Eventually, the 14th and 15th centuries saw a new emerging economy in the form of peasants who were free of their lords. While conditions may not have much improved, they were seen as being free. Indentured servitude. With indentured servitude, an individual, typically in debt or having financial disadvantages, to which they would be in debt to someone who is willing to pay for something. The debtor and the loaner would agree to terms in which the debtor, becoming an indentured servant, works off his or her debt to the loaner, i.e., through time and worth of skill. The length of time was determined by the amount of debt plus the skill level of the debtor. Much like slavery, indentured servants could be considered property and bought or sold. However, unlike slavery, there is typically a time limit and a contract signed by both parties. Like serfdom, indentured servitude was in Europe but came to the Americas after colonization took place. Slavery. Most of the unfortunate people who found themselves to be slaves were often traded for goods or sold as property. The act of slavery and slave trading dates back from Vikings, who would take people from a variety of tribes. Slaves for the early Vikings and other cultures could be the spoils of war, and like in other cultures, sold for goods. Some warring African tribes did and would capture the defeated tribes and sell the defeated tribe to the Europeans during the Transatlantic slave trade. Slavery was slightly different for each culture and treated slaves differently, even though they were property, or were seen as property. Slavery continued. Slaves had no freedom and more often than not, died as a slave. The transatlantic slave trade was a large-scale slave trade that lasted centuries. The slave trade had devastating effects on Africa, both in economics and in terms of fear of being captured. The transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade occurred from approximately the 16th century to the 19th century. At this stage of the trading people, often slaves were from warring tribes, would often be sold to traders for goods, such as clothes or arms. Slaves were often transported over in overly crowded ships in terrible conditions to plantations in the American colonies. This trip was often deadly to the slaves, as disease ran rampant within the highly crowded ships. Slave ships inside. As you can see, these ships were indefinitely very crowded. Paths and goods traded for slaves. This is a very simplified version of the transatlantic slave trade. Often enough goods would also be transported from Europe as well as the Americas. And slaves were transported not only to the islands but to the Americas as well. Here's some resources. Thank you very much for watching. And just out of curiosity, what kind of topics would you like me to cover next? Leave them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you like this video and this content.